Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 78th class. We're getting close to the present tense in the Baha'i faith. We discussed the genius of the guardian last week. This week is a sort of continuation of that. It's about his passing, but it's about all the events surrounding his passing that he was still involved in and executing, as well as how he had, unknown to many, set the stage for the continuation of the faith and the transition from the guardianship or from his guardianship to the House of Justice. And so the next couple of classes will catch us up to the present tense, but we won't stop there because the faith doesn't stop there. And unlike many religions and philosophies and so on that are trying to guess where the world history might take us from here on, the faith, the writings of the faith tell us quite frankly what will happen and the sequence it will happen in, particularly to the next two major stages, and that is you have three ages in the Baha'i history: the heroic age, which begins with the declaration of the Bab and ends with the death of Abdul-Baha, and the formative age, which begins with the administration of the guardian and will end with the establishment of the world order of Baha'u'llah. And so over the next several classes, we will deal not only with this critical transition that takes place after the death of the guardian, which is something you will need to pay close attention to. It is, as I've said before, because we've discussed this subject of the covenant at length before, extremely well done in Rui Book Institute Class Book 8. And I strongly recommend that you take that. It goes into more detail than we can in this class. But it's so subtle, and there's so many things that could have happened that didn't, and so many things that did happen that were totally unanticipated by the majority of believers. So I will go over tonight the sort of continuation of the wisdom of the guardian. It's some of this is quite sad, his passing. At the same time, we're dealing with another curious question. We have so many of them that we come up with, and that is, why is the guardian's burial place in England, in London? Why isn't it at the Holy Land? And to those of you who've been a Baha'i a long time, you don't necessarily ask that question. Well, that's just where it is, because he passed away. Well, why not remove his remains? I mean, after all, the remains of the Bab were moved from place to place for decades until they finally found their resting place at the present shrine of the Bab. And certainly the guardian is a very prominent figure in the history of the faith. So we're going to deal with that. We're going to answer that question tonight, as well as anticipate the questions that will arise over the next couple of classes, namely, how do we deal? We've discussed before that the two pillars of, or two institutions of the faith, the learned and the rulers, have been, until this point, vested in individuals, whether the Bab or Baha'u'llah, whether Abdul-Baha or Shoghi Effendi. Both branches of the learned and the rulers were vested in individuals. Now we're going to find the transition to the fulfillment or the completion of the administrative order, but that's not the end of the history of the faith by any means. But we are, over the next classes, going to see how that transition takes place and what was required and what tests it underwent. So let me begin by sharing my screen, and we will switch to the slides. Most of this is going to be reading, but it's wonderful reading. It's rather moving, and it's most of it excerpted from a work you can find online called The Passing of the Guardian. It was written and put together by Ruhiya Khanum and Farabi, Hand of the Cause Farabi. So I've titled this The Unexpected Lessons Learned from the Guardian's Sudden Passing. And put the date down because it's so close to our present date in November. So 65 years ago. So we're only 65 years from the present tense. But then, as I say, our classes will go on until we reach as far as we can into what the Baha'i faith describes about the future. This account was composed just 1 month after Shoghi Effendi's passing by his widow Ruhiya Khanum and John Farabi, who assisted in the arrangements for the Guardian's funeral. So most of this is written by them, though there'll be one part where we're dealing with the preparation of the body of the Guardian, which is a statement by the doctor, the Hand of the Cause, Mushlegel, who was a physician and who did the preparation of the body, and we'll get to what that means shortly. So let us begin. All those who were privileged to know the beloved guardian Shoghi Effendi from the time of his childhood until his passing, remember him as being incarnate with life. A dynamic, almost electric force seemed to radiate from him. He was always busy, restless, driving on to whatever goal he had set before his eyes. Now, let me stop here and put in my own words. You might say that in contemporary terms, he was a workaholic, but as we said last time, how could he not be? Because he knew that the future of the faith, and as I said, the future of civilization itself rested on his shoulders, and there were so many arenas that needed his attention and that only he could understand and foresee. He was intense in all aspects of his nature, his phenomenal powers of concentration, his deep feelings of passionate attachment to Abdu'l-Baha, his burning conscientiousness in carrying out his duties of the faith of Baha'u'llah as its appointed guardian. These were all facets of the same wonderful nature which God endowed with those special qualities he wished to be uppermost in the one who was firmly to lay the administrative foundation of his faith all over the world, and to plant the first ensigns of its victory in the four corners of the earth. Now remember, this is being written prior to the election of the House of Justice, and so it's being observed he laid this foundation. Of course, that's alluding to what we've talked about before. One of his first duties and one of the first indications of his genius was his realization that to elect the House of Justice, you need the pillars, which were the national assemblies. And so he immediately began assembling these. So you don't have a teaching plan from the Guardian, which is something we will look at in a couple of classes. You don't have a teaching plan from the Guardian until 1937. Because we really weren't ready for a plan. You needed to have the populace spread throughout the world to do this. This is one of the more beautiful pictures of Ruhiya Rabbani, an incredible soul as you can imagine. Those of you who were privileged to meet her realize what strength, what power she had, whether she was going on what was called the Green Light Expedition to meet the tribes in South America, or whether she was teaching elsewhere with her companion, who was the wife of Nakjavani, house member Nakjavani. That the cause of God has reached the point where it stands today is due to the self-sacrificing, constant, unsparing, truly Herculean labors of the guardian. That his heart should have stopped with no warning at the early age of 61 is not so much due to this ceaseless, tireless work, but to the sorrows and afflictions which he endured, for the most part in reserved silence, from the stirrers up of the dissension and the covenant breakers old and new. The early pilgrims after the passing of Abdul Baha remember standing at Shoghi Effendi's bedside, where he had called them to say goodbye, and looking at his face so full of sorrow and despair, his eyes deep sunken and heavily shadowed, and hearing him say he was going away, that it was too much for him. He could not bear it. He left the Holy Land, fought his inner battle, returned, took the helm of this blessed bark, and steered it for over 1/3 of a century through every storm and shoal. But the valiant heart and frail body were receiving blows which left their mark and in the end took their toll. The friends of God are well aware of the achievements of their beloved guardian. What they do not realize fully is that by doing so many things personally over a period of so many years, he and he alone made it possible for the big victories to take place. The fact that he did every single thing himself saved the cause tremendous sums of money. With what he thus saved, he was able to go on and commence a new enterprise. For 36 years, he held in his hands, with power of decision vested solely in him, the funds of the faith at its world center. No expenditures were authorized, no bills were paid that had not been submitted to him first. I put in the first. From the beginning of his ministry until about 1940, he saw in person the engineers, the architects, the lawyers who were carrying out his instructions, as well as many high government officials. It was he who negotiated with them, supervised their work, kept down expenses with an ingenuity and insight, truly supervised their work. It was he who instructed where every step should be built, the height of every wall, the spans between every planted tree, the diameter of every flower bed. This is not hyperbolic. This is not this is actually true. He actually did these things. Even the color of the flowers. It was Shoghi Effendi who, entirely aside from the glorious spiritual leadership manifested in his letters, his books, and his words to the pilgrims, so harbored the financial resources of the faith that in his lifetime the temple in Chicago, the Shrine of the Bab on Mount Carmel, and the International Archives buildings could be completed, as well as the extensive endowments of the faith acquired in Haifa and Akka. He made the plans and paved the way for the temples now being built. He was responsible for the purchase of the temple sites, the National Hazarat al-Quds, and endowments, as well as many other things during these last 5 years. All these accomplishments were made possible by his vigilance and wisdom. Now, this does not yet get to what we will be discussed last time, or will discuss in the future about his wisdom, his foresight, and his genius, as it were. We'll get to that next week when we talk about how he laid the foundation with the International Baha'i Council as forerunner of the institution of the House of Justice. As the faith grew and the years went by, the beloved guardian received more able support from believers of capacity, serving him in the Holy Land and abroad. But his personal supervision of expenses, his personal decision as to what was befitting for the holy places at the World Center was never laid aside. He delegated to others interviews and negotiations locally, but the management, the ordering of objects and furniture for the gardens and holy places, the arrangement of these, the designs and plans for extending them, he kept solely in his own hands, practicing the same economy and showing the same genius as had characterized all his other services to the faith entrusted him by the Master in his will. On October the 20th, 1957, the beloved guardian arrived in London. So here is why he's in London. But for what purpose? Well, Baha'i Khanum tells us. Accompanied by Rahia Khanum for the purpose of ordering some furniture and objects for the International Archives buildings and the gardens above it. He chose London because it is an international center where objects from every country can be found at much cheaper prices than probably in any other one city of the world. He planned to remain a few days and then proceed to Haifa. As was the invariable custom of the beloved guardian during his absence from Haifa, no contact was made with any Baha'i. Ruya Khanum attended to his mail and carried out his orders as she always did. Now, this follows on the heels of what I said last time about the fact that you have no pictures of him. He did not want to be celebrated and so on. This doesn't mean he was aloof by any means. There are many accounts of the times he spent with the pilgrims, and of course there's a plethora of pilgrim notes that were taken by those who were privileged to be in his company in the evenings when he would be with the pilgrims. But it means that he did not want his face to be the face of the faith or himself to be worshipped as a central figure of the faith. On Sunday afternoon, October the 27th, Shoghi Effendi told Ruya Khanum that he had a pain across his knuckles in both hands. She asked him if he had any other pains, and he said no, that just his fingers pained him and were stiff. He added, "I feel so tired, so tired." She begged him to rest, saying that if he did not wish to go to bed, at least he should rest quietly. Became the probability was that he was getting the influenza, which was sweeping through Europe and indeed all over the world. This was the Asian flu we're talking about, an epidemic that hit the United States as well. She herself had been in bed with fever since Thursday night. That night he had a fever, and by the following day his temperature had risen to 39 degrees. Ruya Khanum succeeded in finding an excellent doctor who had taken over the practice of the well-known Harley Street physician who had retired. The doctor was contacted and immediately prescribed medicine for the beloved guardian and came to see him early in the evening when he was able to get away from his hospital. He examined his patient very carefully, heart, chest, temperature, pulse, and so forth, and said that he considered that both the guardian and Ruya Khanum had cases of Asiatic influenza, the beloved guardian's case being the more severe. The constant stress of work, sorrows, and anxieties to which Shoghi Effendi had been subjected had brought about a condition of high blood pressure, which he had had for a number of years. He mentioned this to himself, sometimes to members of the International Council, but he was so strong and healthy, had such tremendous powers of endurance and vitality, that it was difficult to persuade him to devote time to caring for himself. However, for the past 10 years, he had been under the supervision of an excellent doctor who saw him at least twice a year, and he had consented to take some special cures which were good for his general health and calculated to reduce his blood pressure. His doctor often urged him not to overdo things when he returned to Haifa, to get more exercise and rest. But the doctor could not visualize the guardian's life in Haifa. And of course, nobody else could either. And until you read the account and the Priceless Pearl and other accounts, such as that wonderful talk again by Leroy Otis that we went over last time, you can't imagine, you cannot fathom the number of tasks that he was constantly undertaking, nor could he assign them to anyone else, or the nature of his responsibility, could not know that he had to read letters, reports, journals, and so on for between 3 to 8 hours a day, just to keep abreast of his work, that he spent about 4 hours most afternoons and evenings after being up and busy from early morning, giving out what strength he had left to the pilgrims, Eastern and Western, that he stood sometimes for hours in all weathers, directing the work he had planned on Mount Carmel at Pachi, that when he was deeply distressed by some situation, he would not feel able to eat and would lose much weight in a few days. At about 6 weeks before the guardian passed away, he was examined by this doctor, who found him in very good health and his blood pressure lower than in years. The doctor who took care of him in London likewise examined his blood pressure and found it satisfactory and not high. During the week of the beloved guardian's illness, and indeed a number of times during the weeks before his illness, he complained that he had no appetite. He said, "I don't know what has happened to me. I have completely lost my appetite. I don't eat for 24 hours, but I still have absolutely no appetite whatever. It is now weeks that I have been like this. The same thing is happening to me that happened to Baha'u'llah when he lost his appetite after the death of Nabab." And of course, Nabab was the wife of Baha'u'llah and the mother of Abdul Baha, Baha'i Khanum, and Mirza Mehdi. On Tuesday, Ruhi Khanum had recovered sufficiently for the doctor to allow her to go out on important errands. As she had bronchitis following the flu, he would check on her condition when he had finished his visit with the beloved guardian. And in this way, she was able to find out from him exactly how he felt Shoghi Effendi was progressing. The same day, a very heavy mail had been received. And as Shoghi Effendi's temperature was still high, she persuaded him not to look at it. But the next morning, he called for his mail and insisted on going over it personally, as he always did. A great many cables were received and answered by the beloved guardian during this last week of his life. He said to Ruhi Khanum towards the end of the week, "Do you realize that we have done nothing but work this week?" He was anxious to leave London and carry out his original plan of returning to Haifa. However, the doctor was very severe on this point and told him frankly that he was quite free to call in another doctor if he wished, but that as long as he was taking care of him, he could not give his consent to his departure until a week after his temperature had fallen. The guardian accepted this. The doctor was very careful of the beloved guardian. When he came every day, instead of being in a hurry like some doctors, he would sit with the guardian, examine him thoroughly, and stay usually a half hour, and one evening he remained an hour to chat with his patient. He invariably found him sitting in bed reading, surrounded by papers, and his briefcase beside him. And one evening he asked Ruhi Khanum privately, what was the guardian's work? She replied that he was a religious leader and had many responsibilities. The doctor obviously liked his patient, and after he had been coming, for 3 or 4 days, he told Ruhi Khanum, after leaving the beloved guardian's room, that he was smiling tonight. That beautiful smile had affected him too. The doctor told the guardian that on Friday he could get up and sit in his armchair as a change from bed in order to get his strength back. But Shoghi Effendi did not want to do this, and he continued his work, sitting in bed and resting every now and then. However, all during his illness, the guardian had gotten up to wash, to get papers from his desk, and so on. There was no time when he was too weak or ill to get out of bed, not even the days when his fever was high. On Saturday morning, the beloved guardian told Ruhiya Khanum that he wanted a large table placed in his room, big enough so that he could lay out on it the map of the world on which he had been working. Now, some of you may have seen this map. I'm going to show you a picture of it later, but it's one of the things you see on pilgrimage that the guardian worked on, not just one of them. He did a number of them, where he would plan where people should go in order to establish new centers. He had prepared one of those beautiful maps he used to make, showing the progress of the work, and this one he called the halfway point of the 10-year crusade. In other words, the progress made and the victories won during 5 years. He had already worked a great deal on this map. Indeed, it seems a strange coincidence that the first time and the last time he worked on it should both have been occasions on which he was ill, symbolic of the great sacrifice of his life and the strength that went into the conception and prosecution of the World Crusade. And the World Crusade is the 10-year World Crusade that the Guardian instigated from 1953 to 1963. After 2 months before he passed, the beloved guardian had had a cold with a temperature the first night. The next day he had no fever, but it was understood he would remain in bed and rest. It was that day he worked on his map for the first time, for about 10 hours, and it was on Saturday, November the 2nd, that he worked on it for the last time. He told Ruhiya Khanum that he wanted her to check over carefully with him the figures, and said that the concept for adding a few extra details and making sure that what was on the map agreed with his various lists, the work was finished. She remonstrated with him and begged him not to work, saying that in a few days he would be stronger and could complete it. But he said, "No, I must finish it. It is worrying me. There is nothing left to do but check it. I have 1 or 2 names to add that I found in this mail, and I will finish it today." In the early afternoon, he stood in front of the table and worked for about 3 hours. The table was strewn with pencils and files of papers, which constituted the guardian's lists of languages, tribes, countries, temples, Hazrat al-Quds, work completed, work being carried out, and a tremendous amount of data. At one time, while Ruhiya Khanum was checking over with him the various lists and totals, he said to her, as he had said many, many times during the last year, "This work is killing me. How can I go on with this? I shall have to stop it. It is too much. Look at the number of places I have to write down. Look how exact I have to be." Now, I don't know whether I left it in here or not, but at one point in this account, the Guardian talks about how, well, no, it was in the talk, wasn't it, of Leroy Ois, where Ois poses the question, did he think that the Guardian foreknew that he was dying? And he says there were some indications that he might have and other indications that he did not. One of them that was an indication that he might have known was about all of his papers and work, and they were just spread all over the room one time. And Leroy always, I think, said he started helping him pick him up, and the Guardian said, "No, don't, there's no use." And he told Ios, he said, "You know, when just before Baha'u'llah died, Abdu'l-Baha walked into his room and his papers were just strewn all over the place. And the Abdu'l-Baha began to pick them up, and Baha'u'llah said, "No, it's no use, I've done." And then the same thing happened with Abdu'l-Baha, that I don't know whether Shoghi Effendi, but walked into his room and found his papers everywhere. And he went on to say, in effect, that I can't do this anymore. In effect, that it's too much. So there was some foreshadowing and foreboding about on the guardian's part that he just couldn't continue. The beloved guardian looked tired after working on his map that day. He went back to bed and continued reading the many reports he had received. He had only had a mouthful to eat at lunchtime, and he refused to eat any dinner at all. That evening, he spoke with great depression. He had made many plans for his winter's work in Haifa, and many times he discussed these with Ruhiya Khanum, outlining to her some of the work he was going to do on Mount Carmel and in the gardens above the archives, how he was going to furnish the International Archives building itself with the things that had been ordered, and that upon his arrival, his first act would be to go over to Baji and himself give instructions for the demolition of the buildings inhabited for so many years by the archbreakers of the covenant, of Baha'u'llah's covenant, who had caused the beloved master so much sorrow. Now, this is something that Ios also says, that was one of the reasons he didn't think the guardian foreknew he was going to pass, because this was something very dear to him, that they had now cleared out all of the relatives and remnants of the covenant breakers. Because while you may not know it, if you can look at some early pictures of Baji, it wasn't just the one building we see there now. It was a complex of buildings, and the covenant breakers occupied other buildings which the guardian wanted the privilege of having them directing how they should be destroyed and so forth. That big ridge that runs adjacent to or perpendicular to Baji was made, my understanding is that it is a garden now, but underneath it are the remains of those buildings. He talked about the disposition he intended to make of the stones and rubble of these houses, and his ideas for extending the garden at Baji. Many times during the past months, he had spoken with enthusiasm of these plans he was going to carry out. But this evening he said to her, "Who is going to go back and do all these things? I have no strength left. I am a broken reed. I can't do anything more. I have no spirit left to do anything more. Now we will be going back. Who is going to go up that mountain and make all those plans and stand for hours and supervise the work? I can't do it. And I'm not going to do anything more about the houses in Baji. Let them stay like that until I see how I feel. And I'm not going to furnish the inside of the archives this winter. It can wait another year until everything that is needed to furnish it is collected. I shall just see the pilgrims and stay in my room and rest and do the few things that I have to do. I am not even going to take the telegrams back from Jesse. This is Jesse Revell he's talking about, and make copies of them and keep all the receipts the way I've done all these years. She did this in the summer. She can go on doing it in the winter. I am too tired." He was very, very sad and depressed and spoke words such as these for a long time. It was not the first time that Ruhiya Khanum had heard him speak in this vein, but it was with far greater intensity and in more specific detail than she had ever heard before, and it distressed her very deeply. That evening, when the doctor came, he was satisfied with the guardian's condition and said he could certainly leave on Tuesday morning. He told him he could go out if he wanted and get some fresh air. He also told the guardian, that he had heard over the radio that well over 200 people had died of influenza during the week, and they discussed this a little together. When the doctor left that night, after staying quite a while, the guardian said, "I like him very much. He is a fine man and a good doctor." The next day, the guardian appended a few lines to all the English letters that had been written for him, and went over matters regarding his work, dictating to Rhea Khanum some instructions to be mailed and telling her to write to 2 other letters herself that afternoon. He did not wish to get up, preferring to remain in his room, mostly reading his papers in bed or attending to things on his desk. He later read over the letters that she had written and appended something to one of them. In one of the reports, he read something that caused him intense indignation, and he spoke to her about it. He had also been upset during these past few days by some news given him concerning the activities of the covenant breakers, and referred to it more than once. Such things always distressed him. As Sunday was the doctor's day of rest, the guardian had said the day before that he did not think it was necessary for him to come. However, the doctor telephoned that evening to inquire how Shoghi Effendi was and expressed his willingness to come if he was needed. Rhea Khanum, who was speaking on the telephone beside the guardian's bed, conveyed this message to him, but he said he felt better and that there was no need for the doctor to come. It was then agreed that he would make his last call the following afternoon. Rhea Khanum sat in the room with the guardian, and they talked for a while about everyday things. At 9:30, she asked him if he would not like to go to sleep, and as she was sure he was tired, he asked her, "What time is it?" And she said 9:30. He said, "It's too early to go to sleep now. If I go to sleep now, I shall wake up early and then I won't be able to go to sleep again. Stay a while longer and talk." About 10 o'clock, she again asked him if he did not wish to go to sleep, and he said yes. She did the last few things to make him comfortable before retiring, and after saying good night, left the room, asking him before she went to be sure and call her in the night if he needed anything. Both Saturday and Sunday nights, Rhea Khanum did not sleep well, lying awake in the middle of the night for long hours. It would not be correct to say that she had the slightest premonition of what was to come, but she did not sleep well, and her heart was heavy and sad. On the morning, Monday, November the 4th, she went to the door of the guardian's room, knocked gently, and when she received no answer, she entered the room. The curtains were drawn over the windows, and the room was in twilight. She saw the beloved guardian lying on his left side facing her, with his left hand folded over towards his right shoulder and his right arm over his left one in a most relaxed and comfortable position. His eyes were 3/4 open, and she thought he was drowsy, in that state when people wake up and lie comfortably beginning to think of the day's work. She asked him how he had slept and if he felt better. When he neither moved nor replied, and he seemed unnaturally still, a wave of agonizing terror swept over her. She leaned over him and seized his hand. He was ice cold, absolutely rigid. As the window was not open and the room was very warm, he must have ascended several hours earlier. In spite of her own condition, within 2 minutes she had reached his doctor by phone at the hospital and told him that she was afraid that his patient had passed away and begged him to come instantly in case there was something that could still be done. The doctor arrived shortly. In order to calm Rhea Khanum, he gave heart injections to the beloved guardian, massaged his heart. But of course, it was absolutely useless. A few minutes later, a second physician arrived and confirmed there was nothing to be done. The diagnosis was death caused by coronary thrombosis. Nothing in the world could have saved the beloved guardian's life. If the best physicians had been standing beside him, they could not have prevented his passing away from the clot of blood that suddenly entered one of his heart's vessels. Now, that ends the narration of the events leading up to his passing. But the question I asked at the outset of our meeting was, why is he buried in London? Why wasn't he moved to the Holy Land, which would be, you would think, fit and proper? And the reason, of course, to Baha'is who are well acquainted with laws regarding death and burial, know that in the Agdas, a Baha'i is not supposed to be interred more than an hour's journey from the place of their demise. And what's striking about what occurs now is not only did they determine that, of course, he must be buried in London, but they had to determine exactly what an hour's distance was from the place of his death. And so there were only certain places, certain cemeteries that were an hour's drive or less. They were that particular of abiding by the laws of the Agdas. And so this is one of the lessons that I think is very important we learn from this, that as much as I'm sure the guardian would have loved to be interred near the burial place of the Bab and Abdul Baha and Baha'u'llah, he is in a foreign land and must remain there in his physical body. There was no question about it. And this is an amazing thing to me. Very careful instructions were given to the undertaker by Rahia Khanum. And these instructions, of course, have to do with how the body is to be prepared, that it should not be embalmed, that it should be washed and cleansed, anointed, and wrapped in shrouds. No injections of any kind to preserve the body must be given, and that nobody must be allowed to wash it, as provisions would be made for this according to our faith. He fully understood this. Now, when nobody should wash it, that doesn't mean it shouldn't be washed. It means it should be done either by a member of the family or someone designated by the family to do this. He fully understood this, as London is a great world metropolis where people of many religions, customs live and die. The friends must bear in mind that in all the arrangements made after the passing of the beloved guardian, the laws of the Agdas, which he himself had so repeatedly stressed and constantly upheld, had to be obeyed. The size of London and the fact that only suitable burying grounds lie in its outskirts had to be constantly remembered so that no mistake would be made in transporting his precious remains more than an hour's journey. It was the longing of the four hands who, from the very day of his ascension, became responsible for all the pressing matters that had to be attended to in such a short space of time, to have him transported to the National Hazrat al-Quds, where the friends could gather and pray until the funeral took place. Investigation, however, showed that the journey from the part of London where the beloved guardian had passed to the National Hazrat al-Quds, it's a national center, and from there back again in the same general direction to the burial place would take more than an hour, and the plan had to be abandoned. Now, this is a account by Dr. Adalbert Muschlegel, hand of the cause, who was a physician and who was appointed by Ruhiyya Khanum to prepare the body, to wash it and anoint it. And it's most touching. Something new happened to me in that hour that I cannot, even after a few days, speak of, but I can mention the wisdom and love that I felt pour over me. In that moment, which to worldly eyes would have appeared so different there was a tremendous spiritual force, such as I've only felt in my life in the holy shrines. My first impression was the contrast between the body left behind and the majestic, transfigured face, a soul-stirring picture of the joyous victory of the eternal over the transient. My second impression as I prayed and thought and carefully did what I had to do was that in this degree of consecration to the work of God, I should work all my life, and mankind should work 1,000 years in order to construct the kingdom on earth. And my third thought was, as I washed each member of his body and anointed it, that I had thanked those beloved hands which had worked and written to establish the covenant, those feet that had walked for us, that mouth that had spoken to us, that head that had thought for us. And I prayed and meditated and supplicated that in the short time left to me, the members of my body might hasten to follow in his path of service. And my last thought was of my own distress, because I felt how unworthy my hands were to anoint that blessed brow with attar of rose, as the masters of old were wont to do with their pupils. And yet what privileges, what duties fall to us, the living, to watch over what is past and mortal, be it ever so exalted. A great deal of mercy, love, and wisdom were hidden in this hour. As all stood silently, this skips over to the burial itself. As all stood silently waiting for the coffin to be lowered into the grave, Rhea Khanum felt the agony of the hearts around her penetrate into her own grief. He was their guardian. He was going forever from their eyes, suddenly snatched from them by the immutable decree of God, whose will no man dare question. They had not seen him. They had not been able to draw near him. She decided to ask for it to be announced that before the coffin was placed in the grave, the friends who wished might pass by it and pay their respects. For over 2 hours, the believers, Eastern and Western, filed by. For the most part, they knelt and kissed the edge or the handle of the casket. Rarely indeed in history can such a demonstration of love and grief have been seen. So the lessons learned. Further evidence of the guardian's genius was demonstrated in his creation. And again, these are things we'll go over next week. Excuse me, let me have some tea. Of the International Baha'i Council. We'll get into what that was and how it was created by the guardian, and then finally how it was elected in 1961 in preparation for the election of the House of Justice. His selection of those to serve as the hands of the cause. My brother used to make a great deal of this, and it didn't strike me as important at the time, but it does now, that the individuals he selected, no doubt he selected with great circumspection and great insight into their characters. But notice that they're not the same. They're not from a class or a caste or a character of people. You have, I think of Bill Sears, who was a radio announcer and a TV personality. You have people of high standing and low standing from different countries, and is just what they represented was a cross-section of the best of humanity, the best in a spiritual sense, but totally dissimilar from one another in every other circumstance. So I say they're ordinary believers, ostensibly ordinary believers. They were not ordinary. I'm sure if you met any of them, and I was privileged to meet about 10 of them, none of them were ordinary in any sense. His designation of the hands of the cause, the creation of the pillars of the Universal House of Justice, the NSAs, the creation of the foundation for the learned and the rulers. This we will discuss next week, how he set the foundation for these two branches of the administrative order. the designating the last contingent of hands, and designated them and this was only in October, a month before he died, as the chief stewards of Baha'u'llah's embryonic world order, who have been invested by the unerring pen of the center of his covenant with the dual function of guarding over the security and of ensuring the propagation of his father's faith. So they had these two duties, protection and teaching. This was legally strategic, this last thing he did, legally strategic, because it contained implications required for the custodians to exercise binding authority concerning matters both within and without the faith. As a result, the 9 hands of the cause in the Holy Land, elected by all the hands of the cause, according to the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha, had the legal authority to take charge of all Baha'i properties and to remain as chief stewards of the Baha'i faith until the election of the Universal House of Justice 6 years later. So the custodians, the administration of the custodians is a collection of works of all of the letters that they sent out. I became a Baha'i during that period, and it was very interesting that the Baha'i News, which would come out every Baha'i month, would have on the first page messages from the chief custodians. The strength of the covenant, while laid out in legal documents, is only as strong as the institutions created by it and the willingness of the believers to uphold those institutions, as we will see next class regarding the attempt to undermine that authority and the indisputable logic the documents contain. And that is another sign of the genius of the guardian and of the covenant itself, is that the checks and balances are there, but unless the people follow them and utilize them, they as we see in our own government, the United States, it doesn't matter how wise the things are created if people don't follow them. And of course, you have an attempt by one of the hands of the cause, Mason Remy, to usurp the authority of the guardianship. Remember my observation about Abdu'l-Baha holding the prayer beads and what I said about the significance. That Shoghi Effendi was buried in a land far away from his home, and the Holy Land demonstrated for all, even as it does now, that all Baha'is are under obedience to the laws of Baha'u'llah, that the hour's distance had to be meticulously adhered to, even as his body was prepared, according to the guidance in the Kitab-i Aqdas. Excuse me. That because of the guardian's work in every arena, the faith was fully prepared to make this, perhaps the most critical, final, and complex transition from having both branches of the institution vested in a single figure to having the foundation for both branches to grow into fullness from the guardian's foresight and establishing the hands of the cause as the learned in Baha and the National Spiritual Assemblies and the International Baha'i Council as forerunners of the rulers. And that is the burial place of the guardian, for those of you who have not been there outside London. And again, an astonishing wisdom in everything that happens here, because what could demonstrate the value of the covenant and obedience to the laws of Baha'u'llah greater than this monument to the one guardian we will have, the guardianship will endure perpetually. The guardian himself buried in another land. This makes a very important statement, that we abide by the law, however uncomfortable or strange they may seem to us at first.